This quiet plateau is not what it seems. It is legally recognised as part of Syria, but was captured by Israel in 1967. Dotted throughout the grassland are dozens of Israeli fortifications and the rusting hulks of destroyed Syrian and Israeli military equipment, alongside memorials to those who lost their lives here. This is the disputed Golan Heights.
War in the Middle East. Israeli forces drive spearheads north into Syria.
A 1,200 square kilometre high-altitude plateau overlooking much of northern Israel in the valleys below. And I'd cycled for weeks to get here and explore the plateau on a bicycle.
So that village is in Syria. There's a shelter down here. If you hear a siren, which means there's missiles coming, you can jump down here.
But since then, a lot has changed, and the region has found itself in a geopolitical storm once again.
A lightning-fast rebel offensive ending 50 years of authoritarian rule in Syria.
Rebel forces in Damascus have declared the capital city free of longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad.
The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions.
European countries are calling on Israel to withdraw its troops from the buffer zone on its border with Syria.
This is the story of how Israel came to annex and then expand control of Syria's Golan Heights. This is Kibbutz Amir in the Hula Valley, right next to the point where several tributaries meet and become the Jordan River. If you were stood here 80 years ago, this would be the border between a newly established Israeli state and Syria.
The Jordan River forms part of Israel's boundary with Syria and with the state of Jordan.
But today, all of this land is controlled by Israel, including the Golan Heights that you can see in the background, towering an average of 1,100 meters above the flat landscape. And it was from here that my climb up to the plateau would begin. But remember this landscape, because it's the region's geography that makes Israel so determined to maintain control of the Golan Heights. I packed up my things and got ready for the grueling ascent.
Well, you can see the road that I have to go up. It does not look fun. And then hopefully that should be the start of Golan Heights up there.
En route, I cycled through lush farmland. And this is another important thing to remember. This is the area of Israel and the occupied territories with the most rainfall, and where you'll find some of the region's most fertile agricultural land.
Oh my God. Okay, and so the real climb begins. I don't know if you can see behind me how far I've come, but it is a long way down now. I've just reached the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is basically a high altitude plateau with this big climb up to it. And then up here, it should flatten out just a little bit. It's still going to be a lot of climbing, but the further I go, the less steep it should get.
Now that we're actually here, to understand how Israel came to control the Golan Heights, we need to go back to the mid-1900s. Israel gained independence as a state in 1948, but it came at a high cost, through a war with all of its Arab neighbours. While Israelis created their new home in what had just weeks earlier been a territory administered by the British called Mandatory Palestine, Palestinians lost theirs. 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were forced from their homes in what came to be known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. and this was a huge blow to all the surrounding Arab nations, as well as the Palestinians who lost their homeland. These countries suddenly found themselves next-door neighbours with their sworn enemy, and in response, they were cooperating with each other. All of them were members of a regional organisation called the Arab League.
The so-called Arab League vowed the total defeat and utter annihilation of the infant nation.
Originally formed in 1945 in a push to remove Western colonial influence from the Arab world, and unified in their opposition to the emergence of a Jewish state in Palestine. That brings us to the 1950s. Now, the displacement of so many Palestinians and the war fought between Israel and its neighbours had left a lot of tension remaining in its wake. And between Israel and Syria and Jordan, there was an additional flashpoint. And it all came down to a resource. In the deserts of the Middle East, far more precious than oil or gold. Fresh water.
To harness and divert the Jordan River waters, Israel will spend £100 million sterling.
This is the Negev Desert in the south of Israel.
2/3 of Israel's land area, the Negev Desert, lies barren, largely unsettled, useless because of the lack of water.
But the young and growing Israel had an ambitious plan.
It was part of Israel's Jordan River project.
Divert hundreds of millions of cubic meters of water from its largest freshwater lake, the Sea of Galilee, fed by the Jordan River, to the arid regions further south. In 1953, construction on this project began. This was the birth of Israel's national water carrier.
Mr. Weiner, considering the current political situation, it is perhaps a fair question to ask whether the Jordan River project can at all be completed without the cooperation of your Arab neighbors.
And here lay a big problem, because for the Arab League, this was unacceptable. And at the time, there was a charismatic leader on the scene.
In 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser seized power in Egypt.
Gamal Abdel Nasser was first the Prime Minister and then President of Egypt, who'd come to power in a bloodless coup. None of the conflicts in this part of the world are isolated from one another, and you can't understand Israel's conflict with Syria without first knowing a bit about Egypt. Nasser presented himself as an anti-imperialist and socialist revolutionary, and a strong supporter of Palestinian determination and statehood. Under his leadership, Pan-Arabism, the idea of a political unity among Arab countries, was flourishing, and many Arab states were cooperating more closely than ever before. Early in his tenure, he'd nationalised the Suez Canal, which had previously been operated by an Anglo-French company, and closed it to Israeli shipping. Britain and France were so outraged by all this that they secretly planned with Israel to capture the Suez Canal by force.
A treaty signed in 1888 guaranteed the Suez Canal as an international waterway for all time. Colonel Nasser repudiated this agreement.
Militarily, they succeeded in 1956, but politically, they failed, and were pressured to return the Suez Canal to Egypt by the United States. This brought down the British and French Prime Ministers, Anthony Eden and Guy Mollet, both of whom eventually resigned. The United Nations sent its first ever armed peacekeeping mission to serve as a buffer between Egyptian and Israeli forces. Nasser had succeeded in ending British and French influence in the region, and he was now immensely popular, seen by many as the leader of the Arab world.
Nasser claimed a great Egyptian victory, and throughout the Arab world, he was compared to Saladin, hero of the Crusades.
جابوا الاساطيل هنا بورسعيد هزموهم بخيبتهم. انتم هنا كتبت لهم ايه على الحيطه بورسعيد؟ بنجيب لهم الكلام اللي على الحيطه ونطلعه لهم، قلت لهم يور كينج ايه؟
And he was inspiring other leaders too. Pan-Arabist ideology was taking hold in Syria.
And it's Damascus that's been the centre of Arab nationalism. Now every Syrian feels that the fight is against Israel and the West.
And Egypt and Syria drew closer together. So close, in fact, that they briefly formed one country for a while.
To Two presidents, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Shukri al-Quwatli of Syria, meet to make history in Cairo with the federation of their two states into one, the United Arab Republic.
The United Arab Republic was short-lived, lasting from 1958 until Syria seceded in 1961. But they still had their common enemy, Israel, and shared pan-Arabist ideals. Back to the Jordan River in the Hula Valley, and the initial Syrian-Israeli border where we started. 3 demilitarized zones had been established between Israel and Syria after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Israel, though, regarded these DMZs as its sovereign territory. And initially, Israel's national water carrier diversion project had been started in one of those zones. So this plan had kicked off a series of bloody border skirmishes. Construction equipment used for the water diversion project was targeted, as were the personnel guarding and operating it. Syria and Jordan also actively supported and sheltered Palestinian guerrilla fighters who mounted cross-border raids into Israel, which responded with raids of its own into Syria and Jordan. The US had tried to get Israel and its neighbours to agree to a water-sharing agreement, called the Johnston Plan, but the Arab states viewed recognising Israel's water rights as akin to state recognition. Officially, they rejected the plan, but they did agree to follow many of its proposals. At a UN summit, the Soviet Union used its veto to force Israel to move the construction site out of the DMZ, but construction went on elsewhere. And as Israel made more progress, Nasser was facing pressure to act. It's now 1964. Israel has completed its national water carrier, and Nasser convenes an Arab League summit in Cairo.
Once again, the Muslim nations of the Middle East, encircling Israel, plotted new and provocative action.
Here, they devised a countermove. If they couldn't stop Israel building the diversion project by force, what else could they do? Play Israel at its own game. Upstream from Israel's national water carrier, they'd start a project of their own to redirect the very sources of the Jordan River through the Golan Heights away from Israel and instead into the Yarmouk, which flows through Jordan. This was the Headwater Diversion Plan, and it would reduce Israel's overall water supply by more than 10%. The closing statement at this summit went further. The existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation. The diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence. If necessary results are not achieved, collective Arab military preparations will constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel. It was also after this meeting that the political and militant umbrella group, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, was formed. The PLO would eventually come to be led by the famous Palestinian nationalist, Yasser Arafat, viewed as a hero of the Palestinian nationalism movement. In response to all this, Israel threatened military retaliation. The cross-border skirmishes stepped up again, and came to be known as the War over Water. Israel attacked the Headwater diversion construction sites in the Golan Heights, and Syria shelled northern Israel. In April 1967, this escalated into an all-out aerial and artillery battle that lasted a day. After this battle, Nasser immediately offered Egypt's assistance to Syria in the event of a future attack from Israel. Now, after these attacks, the Headwater Diversion project was eventually abandoned, but the tension and violence remained. Nasser then started making some bold moves. He expelled the UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula.
Secretary General Ufant is informed that Egypt will no longer allow the UN peacekeeping force to remain on her soil.
And he announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This effectively blockaded the southern Israeli port city of Eilat. If things escalated further, Israel would face another multi-front war. But at the same time, Egypt was involved in a civil war in Yemen, where over 60,000 of its troops, many of its best fighters, were bogged down supporting Republican rebels against the royalist military.
The royalist forces were only denied ultimate victory by Egyptian fighter bombers.
Not exactly ideal for fighting a war at home. Now remember, 1967 is just 20 years after the Holocaust in Europe. After the attempted extermination of their people by the Nazis, many of the Jewish survivors who'd made it to Israel and the first generation of Israelis who'd been born there, known as Sabras, were now prepared to fight their neighbours tooth and nail, and even to fire the first shot. If they fought a war on their own terms, deciding when and where to strike before the surrounding Arab countries could react, they were sure they could win the war. And so, on the 5th of June, 1967, Israel makes its move. The Israeli Air Force crosses into Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian airspace, launching attacks on ground targets, decimating the air forces of all three. Fighting on the ground soon began, but with the immense advantage and total air superiority Israel now had, the battles were over in less than a week. In Israel, this would come to be known as the Six-Day War. Israel captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and finally, the Golan Heights from Syria.
Israeli tank forces advanced toward a branch of the Jordan River to establish control of a strategically important water resource.
With the capture of the Golan Heights, Israel had secured the route through which the sources of the Jordan River could have been redirected. The Arab nations would call this defeat al-Naksa, the setback. And immediately following it, Nasser tendered his resignation. But his popularity remained, and protesters in Egypt took to the streets, demanding he remained president. His political career survived the crisis. He remained in his position, and he was steadfast in his belief that military action was the only way to get Israel out of the newly captured territories. In 1969, he ended a ceasefire with Israel and launched the War of Attrition. This involved strikes and raids across the border in an attempt to wear down Israeli forces in Sinai. The PLO now took a more active role in the fighting as well. Raids were also launched into Israel from Syria and Jordan, sometimes by their own forces, but often by the PLO, and from Israel into those same surrounding countries. The War of Attrition ended in 1970, and aside from a lot of deaths, did not deliver the desired results for the Arab countries. Nasser died of a heart attack while in office the following month. 3 million people attended his funeral, the largest in Egypt's history. He was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. Over in Syria, it was around this time that Hafez al-Assad came to power in a coup. Vehemently opposed to American and Israeli influence in the region, he drew Syria closer to the Soviet Union, allowing it to open the Tartus naval base on its coast in 1971. Russia and Syria would maintain good relations even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1973, Assad and Sadat, taking a leaf out of Israel's book, tried to reset the scales. This time, on the holiest day in Judaism, Yom Kippur, when the country was distracted, marking the holiday, it was the Israelis who were caught off guard.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt. On the Golan Heights, Syria claims it has taken some Israeli positions.
Approaching the heights, they had to risk artillery fire directed from Mount Hermon, which had fallen to Syrian commandos in the first hours of the war.
In what came to be known as the Yom Kippur War, Israel, now on the back foot, looked like it was losing.
The Syrian plan was to cross the ceasefire line in one massive armoured assault. Bridging the canal was achieved through well-tried Soviet expertise and equipment.
But with the Soviet Union supplying the advancing Arab armies, the US sent weapons and ammunition to Israel. This was now one of many proxy wars between the United States and Soviet Union. These new supplies turned the tide. The Israelis were able to push the Egyptians out of Sinai and Syrian forces back to the edge of the Golan Heights. Israel had retained control over the areas it captured in the Six-Day War, but at a high cost. Reminders of the battles that took place here are everywhere. On the northern front in the Golan Heights, 115 Israelis and 2,500 Syrians were killed in the Six-Day War. 6 years later, nearly 800 Israelis and 3,000 Syrians were killed in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The area in which the worst of the battles took place would be nicknamed the Valley of Tears.
I've just stumbled across a memorial park and also an old fortified position where there's tanks and also an old gun.
After another defeat for the Arab nations, and both sides licking their wounds, Egypt's Anwar Sadat eventually agreed to the US-sponsored Camp David Accords, with Israel's begin, and signed a peace deal with Israel a year later. Among the conditions were that Egypt recognise Israel as a state in return for its territory in Sinai back. Sadat successfully charmed Israel's leaders and public, and relations between Egypt and Israel improved. This was viewed by many Arab states as a betrayal and angered them so much that Egypt was expelled from the Arab League for a decade. But Sinai returned to Egyptian control. For Syria, on the other hand, it was a very different story. The country had lost even more territory to Israel, and unlike Egypt, it wouldn't get much of it back. Hafez al-Assad, while he eventually accepted Israel's existence, was determined to contain Israel within its pre-1967 borders and limit its influence in the region. There would be no peace as long as Israel refused to withdraw its troops back to the Lowlands. In a disengagement agreement, Israel returned a third of the Golan Heights to Syria, but then unilaterally annexed the remaining two-thirds of the plateau it had occupied in 1982.
The Israeli parliament, the Knesset, in debate, the government was being asked to formally annex the occupied Golan Heights. Prime Minister Begin agreed in principle this territory, part of Syria until the 1967 war, would never be returned.
With such vastly different approaches by the two countries, the strong alliance between Syria and Egypt had broken down. Syria joined other Arab nations in the steadfastness and confrontation front, set up by the PLO to isolate Egypt and Sadat as a result of his willingness to negotiate with Israel. Sadat didn't know it, but with this peace deal, he'd signed his own death warrant.
Anwar Sadat, peacemaker of Egypt, killed in a military assassination.
He was shot at a military parade. His vice president, Hosni Mubarak, would take his place. After the Yom Kippur War, hostilities between Israel and Syria would continue. Syria would intervene in the Lebanese Civil War in 1976, occupying large parts of the country. Syria saw Lebanon both as part of a greater Syrian sphere of influence and a route through which Israel could launch a flanking attack. Combined with the Israeli presence now up on the Golan Heights, this would be disastrous. After the PLO attempted an unsuccessful coup in Jordan, it would move to Lebanon, and Israel would invade the country twice to try and expel the PLO and install a friendly government in Beirut. This would see Israeli and Syrian forces clash once again, until Israel eventually withdrew back to a security zone along the Lebanese-Israeli border. Syrian forces wouldn't leave Lebanon until 2005. Now we have to jump to Iran. Until 1979, it was a monarchy ruled by a Shah installed by Western powers, and had maintained good relations with Israel and hostile relations with Syria, even supplying Israel with oil during its many wars. It was actually the second Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel as a state. But then came the Islamic Revolution.
A
tearful Shah of Iran left his country today on a vacation from which he may never return.
The Shah was overthrown, and an Islamic revolutionary who had been exiled by the Shah, Ayatollah Khomeini, took control of the country.
Khomeini was being helped down the steps of his chartered Air France jet to set foot on Iranian ground for the first time in 15 years. The people were in a frenzy to catch just a glimpse of the man they revere like a god.
The Ayatollah flipped those foreign relations upside down. Iran immediately severed diplomatic relations with Israel. Syria became the first country to recognize the new revolutionary regime. And since then, the Assad regime in Syria has been Iran's most consistent ally. Israel had a new enemy in the Middle East, and Syria had a new friend. Over the following decades, Iran would arm, fund, and train a network of proxies.
Iran-backed groups form a land bridge across the Middle East and connect in an alliance that Tehran calls the Axis of Resistance.
The aim was to counter US and Israeli influence in the Middle East. The only nation-state in this axis of resistance was Syria. By the 1990s, the situation compared to a few decades earlier was unrecognizable. Egypt and Israel were no longer fighting. The PLO was negotiating with the US and Israel. Jordan had by now renounced its claim on the West Bank.
I think we are on our way towards the establishment of a just and durable peace.
Lebanon was weakened and unstable after the Civil War and Israeli invasions. Iran had switched sides and was now the strongest adversary Israel faced in the region. And of all the nations bordering Israel, Syria was the only one still truly in the game. Syria and Israel have never actually signed a peace treaty, and are technically still in a state of war today. The only other occupied territory Israel eventually withdrew from, until 2023 at least, was the Gaza Strip in 2005. Hafez al-Assad died in 2000 and was succeeded by his son, the notorious dictator Bashar al-Assad. Now we're in Tunisia, December 2010, the city of Sidi Bouzid. A street vendor steps out in front of the local governor's office. His name, one soon to echo around the world, is Mohamed Bouazizi. Yet again, he's had his produce confiscated by corrupt police officers. He's in debt, and he's just doused himself in a liquid. A few moments later, he lights a match, and the gasoline ignites. The self-immolation and death of this man sparks Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution. Within a week, its leader has fled the country. But it won't end in Tunisia. The Arab Spring has begun, and a wave of uprisings are about to spread across the Arab world. One by one, leaders and governments fall. The Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, in power ever since Sadat's assassination 20 years earlier, is the second to go. Libya's Gaddafi falls months later, captured and killed by militia fighters. Yemen's President Saleh is next, meeting a similar fate. The uprisings spread to Syria, fueled by high unemployment rates, corruption, and political repression. Bashar al-Assad responds brutally. Protesters are shot in the streets, but this only makes the unrest escalate further, into full-scale rebellion. He turns to his allies, Russia and the Axis of Resistance, for help. Russia provides air support, bombing rebel groups. Iran-backed militias from Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan and Yemen also come to Assad's aid. Assad uses chemical weapons on his own people. Extremist groups exploit the moment and gain more power than they've ever had. A black and white flag becomes infamous around the world. It belongs to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, which will conquer and control large parts of northern and eastern Syria, as well as northwestern Iraq, for 5 years during the Syrian Civil War. Another rival extremist group is a branch of Al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra Front, led by a man named Abu Muhammad al-Julani. And remember him, because he'll come back later in a pretty big way. The rise of these extremist groups and the involvement of Iran and Russia spark fears in Western and Middle Eastern countries. A US-led coalition of these nations intervenes and supports the rebel groups and a Kurdish autonomous region in the northeast of Syria. Israel conducts airstrikes against Iranian and Iran-backed groups in Syria, in a civil war that will claim the lives of almost 620,000 people and displace over 12 million. But with the help of his allies, Assad clings on to power and regains control of most major cities. The civil war enters a stalemate and a period of lower intensity with small pockets of resistance. ISIS loses all the territory it once held. After the Arab Spring, Syria's Assad is now one of the last men standing. And that brings us to the state of things when I was cycling in the region in 2022. Now, back to my ride through the Golan Heights, where things weren't going according to plan.
I've got a flat tyre. Again, this is like a kilometre or two to walk with the bike.
I made my way to a nearby kibbutz. And this is where one of Israel's long-term strategies becomes clear.
This place looks like half finished.
Populate the territory it has occupied. Build towns, villages, and kibbutzim there, and it makes it easier both politically and militarily to maintain control of the region. I spent the night on a local's porch, fixing up my bike under their lights, before I'd continue to the Syrian border the following day.
So much military around here.
In the light of day, I only had to glance around me to see why this area is so strategically valuable. When the region was still under Syrian control, the high-altitude plateau gave Syrian artillery a huge advantage to bombard the valleys I'd cycled up from, and the flat, open landscape is ideal for moving military vehicles across. So the fighting up here was particularly vicious.
At 1400, a 50-minute artillery barrage began. It paved the way for the Syrian armour, which then swept past the border posts.
There was a lot of fighting out here, and massive tank battles between Syria and Israel. Syria eventually won those battles and has occupied 2/3 of the Golan Heights ever since. Syria still holds the other third, and the Syrian border is somewhere up this way.
This was the situation when I was cycling here. That has changed, but more on that shortly. After Israel captured the Golan Heights, 130,000 Syrians who lived here either fled or were expelled by Israeli forces. Some Syrian Druze communities were allowed to remain. The Druze are an ethno-religious minority group. There are some 20,000 Syrians still living in the occupied Golan Heights. Most of them are Druze. These indigenous Syrian Druze do face discrimination here, but there is not the same level of violent repression and human rights abuses here as in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. As I pedalled, I passed new wind farms and settlements, further reminders of Israel's determination to establish an Israeli civilian presence up here and entrench their control of the plateau. One of those settlements had a familiar name.
The new village bearing Trump's name is a far cry from the real estate projects which made him famous.
Trump Heights.
It was given Trump's name because of this moment.
President Trump announcing a significant move involving Israel.
In a moment, I will sign a presidential proclamation recognizing Israel's sovereign right over the Golan Heights.
In 2019, during Donald Trump's first term in office, the USA became the first and only country to recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. The rest of the international community still considers it to be Syrian land.
We do not recognize Israel's sovereignty over the territories occupied by Israel since June 1967, including the Golan Heights. Annexation of territory by force is prohibited under international law.
The same, of course, goes for many of the Syrians who live here.
They are the Syrians here. We consider that Golan is a part of Syria, occupied part of Syria. We see ourselves as Syrians. Not Trump, neither Netanyahu can decide for this land.
The move by the US, though, means a lot more American investment here. So, more money for Israel to expand its presence.
Israel has approved a plan to double its population in the occupied Golan Heights, citing a new front along its border with Syria.
Investors from the United States have already started to put their eye on Golan Heights because now, when it's official, people are planning big things.
I was about to cycle down this road, and then I looked at this sign and I thought it was just white and hadn't been painted, but it's a military firing area, and I almost entered it by accident. There's a shelter down here. It's actually a drainage tunnel under the road, but if you hear a siren, which means there's missiles coming from Syria, say, over there, or from Lebanon over there, then you can jump down here. It's very thick concrete, and I guess you go in the tunnel down there. The tunnel goes under the road, and then I guess it's able to withstand a blast.
A lot of the signposts here, like this one, are riddled with bullet holes.
So many bullet holes in the signs here.
I was now just a stone's throw from Syrian-controlled territory.
Syria is literally just over those fields.
Now, the military presence was becoming far more noticeable.
I'm now about 500 meters away from the border with Syria. Just on the other side of this hill here, up this road that you can see behind me, is the Syrian border. The Lebanese border is a bit further up that way, basically behind the mountain in the background. I don't know if you can see it. And then the Jordanian border is down this way a little bit further. I'll also be cycling along that today. Israel has had conflicts with all of these nations multiple times. It's a demilitarized zone apparently just over there, but the whole area is mined. The reason there are so many mines here is because Syria is just 500 meters across those fields there. There are mines on both sides of me now, and then this road kind of goes between them. You see these like mounds, just unnatural looking mounds, and behind them, like most of the time, there's a tank or something, or a bunker. UN truck over there.
a United Nations peacekeeping force is stationed in a demilitarized zone between Israeli and Syrian-controlled territory. At the time I was here, the DMZ was made up of two boundaries. The western Alpha line that I was cycling along, which Israeli forces were prohibited from crossing, and on the other side, the eastern Bravo line that Syrian forces couldn't cross, creating a small buffer zone between the two, just 60 kilometers southwest of Syria's capital, Damascus.
There's a bunker, just there. Yeah, this is the most militarized place I've ever been, I think. More memorials.
The skeletal remains of some Syrian military equipment is left as trophies in the fields, sometimes proudly displayed beside Israeli memorials.
That's a car on a pole. So in the size of these buildings, I guess they were built pre-war. There are so many impact marks, which I'm guessing are from bullets. That's the Syrian-controlled side of Golan Heights. The 1/3 of it that Syria still holds. And it's all these yellow signs here. That's because on both sides of me now, here and here, it's all mines. There's a wall or fence a few hundred meters away over there going through the fields, and on the other side of it is Syria. All of those towns and villages and houses, they're all in Syria, and there you can see the wall that goes between Israel and Syria.
This part of Syria, just across the DMZ, is home to numerous armed rebel groups. It's where the Syrian Civil War first began in 2011. Now, since I was cycling here, things have changed.
Major breaking news in Syria as we are coming to air this morning. A lightning-fast rebel offensive ending 50 years of authoritarian rule in Syria.
In the space of a few weeks, the Syrian Civil War, thought to be dormant in a stalemate since 2019, reignited.
The civil war began in 2011, but the rebels with links to Al-Qaeda were forced into retreat 5 years later. Now they're back, and in just 10 days have taken the whole of Aleppo.
In December 2024, a Turkish-backed group called Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, spearheaded an assault from the northern city of Idlib, alongside other rebel groups and Turkish-backed mercenaries.
Remarkably, the city of Hama now seems to have fallen to the rebels without much of a fight, and there are even reports of clashes in Damascus, the capital itself.
To say the overlapping allegiances and rivalries of the Syrian Civil War are complicated would be an understatement. But behind it all, Turkey was pulling the strings.
Some of these rebels are backed by Turkey, which says it wants to protect Syrian civilians from the Assad regime.
This framing is a red herring. What Turkey wants, what it really wants, is an end to the Kurdish autonomous region in northeastern Syria.
Turkey has built up its military presence along the border, leading to fears that it may attack Kurdish forces in Syria.
Turkey's now looking to turn its years of support for HTS into leverage against a Kurdish militia that has long been number one on Turkey's enemies list, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF.
At any other time, Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group next door in Lebanon, would have come to Assad's aid. But But with Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon and the decapitation of the organization earlier in 2024, and Assad's other ally, Russia, bogged down in Ukraine, Assad was out of options. As the Syrian army was retreating in the face of HTS and its allies, more dormant groups made their move from the south, from the area I'd taken a few clips of across the border, largely made up of fighters from Druze communities.
To the south of Damascus, other rebel groups are also mobilizing, where the revolution started back in 2011.
They unified under the banner of the Southern Operations Room, or SOR. As HTS and its allies pushed south, the SOR moved north to Damascus, squeezing Syrian army forces. Assad's regime collapsed within weeks.
Rebel forces in Damascus have declared the capital city free of longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad.
Assad himself fled to Russia. The rebels captured Damascus, and the HTS leader is now in charge. And he is a man you've met before. Abu Muhammad al-Julani is back. He was one of the leaders of that Al-Qaeda affiliate, only he's rebranded. Now he's distanced himself from Al-Qaeda and claims he will protect ethnic and religious minorities in Syria. Whether that messaging is just for optics or part of a deeper ideological shift is yet to be determined. But in all the chaos as Assad fell, Israel sensed an opportunity.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime offers great opportunity, but it also means we have to take action against possible threats.
The Israeli military launched 600 strikes on Syria in the 8 days after Assad's fall, destroying 80% of its strategic military capabilities, chemical weapons stockpiles, and most of the Syrian navy. One of their key targets was Syrian air defense systems. The Israeli army moved into the demilitarized zone I'd cycled along the edge of, taking 400 square kilometers of territory, the remaining 1/3 of the Golan Heights that Syria had controlled when I was there.
Israeli troops have been operating in a buffer zone, separating the Golan Heights from Syria. Military officials say they're working to thwart potential threats and to prevent a takeover by terrorist elements near the Syrian border.
The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found.
Despite Netanyahu's claim, it's hard to see Israel willingly giving up this territory anytime soon. Israeli forces took full control of the summit of Mount Hermon. The high-altitude vantage point will now allow them to more easily detect drones coming from Iraq or Lebanon. It also moves Damascus closer to artillery range and gives them a commanding position over Hezbollah in Lebanon. It also gives Israel more control over the water sources of the Jordan River. And one final piece of the puzzle, with Syria's air defences out of action, Israel now has an air corridor through which it can launch strikes against Iran. I pedalled south along the remainder of the Syrian border, to the point where Jordan, Syria, and Israel meet. This valley is where the Arab League's Headwater Diversion project would have diverted the sources of the Jordan River into the Yarmouk that flows through Jordan. And from here, I had a view over what was once part of Syria, and the resource over which so much blood was spilled.
This is the Sea of Galilee. It's Israel's biggest lake. In fact, it's one of its only ones, but it's an enormous freshwater lake. It's below sea level down there, actually. It is enormous.
I began my descent back to the lowlands of northern Israel. And from here, I'd cycle into another military occupation. Next, I'd be heading south to spend the following month cycling through the occupied Palestinian territory of the West Bank. A journey that would make the military presence in the Golan Heights pale in comparison.